Hello and welcome to another episode of HYPIA interviews with Hyperpolyglots. I'm President HYPIA, Dr. Usman Chohan, and today I have the pleasure of having Matheus Ventura-Lang, a long-standing HYPIA member. I would like to welcome you. Welcome, Matheus.
Thank you, Usman. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. Let's talk a little bit about your language journey. Well, how many languages do you speak, and how did you go about learning them?
All right, so let me count. Like it's always a thing like I gotta count, but I would say it's around 12, 13, like at the moment. So while I grew up bilingual, so I have two native languages, German and Portuguese. I did also learn like English at school. Then growing up in Latin America made me also learn Spanish because most of our neighboring countries in Brazil were Spanish speaking. Then I learned also French and Italian, Dutch, Norwegian, Swedish, which is a bit rusty but still going. Um, I did also some Afrikaans. Then, uh, yeah, let me know. Uh, Russian, yeah, lately, like Romanian, and yeah, I think that's it. Like to be honest, I'm trying to see if I remember any other language, but yeah, I mean, of course, I've done stuff also like in translating like Latin and ancient Greek and some Old Norse, but it was mainly like for translations, like yeah, not speaking or anything like that. Yeah, but I think that's it. Like if I'm not wrong or forgetting any language, yeah.
So, what is the motivation behind adding to it other than your mother tongue or something nearby your country? Why would you go beyond that? What was the motivation?
Well, I suppose I discovered very early, like where I realized from a very early age that the world was multilingual in this regard, and the interest of, I was kind of fascinated by etymology and the meaning of the words and how can it be tricky in a certain way and how can it be helpful on another way when we go and deepen our knowledge on the meaning of the words themselves and how to construct phrases and phraseology and so forth. And that's what made me want to discover the other languages. And I was kind of went natural because I was first always tied to the linguistic groups of the languages I already spoke. So I spoke a Romance language as a native language and a Germanic language. So I was kind of like deep diving in these two families, like until I decided not that long ago, I think like about 2 years ago, that I wanted to go for a new challenge, and I started learning Russian as my first Slavic language and the first language that I wanted to learn like consciously outside of my comfort zone of these languages of the language families I know and I'm familiar with. So I think about the first thing was the curiosity to know what the other perspective and how many perspectives there are. Just starting by random things, just analyzing the meaning of words from a very, very early age. Yeah.
So, tell me about some examples that really struck you, that you were looking at a word and you were like, wow, what's the deal with this? Where does this originate? And what is the etymology? What are some examples of words that really captivated you when you ended up going on a way tangent learning about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, for example, if you take the word to make a decision or to or it's very interesting because, for example, you make a decision. I think in English, if I'm not wrong, please
Or
correct
take,
me.
take a
Yeah, or you
decision.
take a decision. In Portuguese, it would be something similar, but for example, in German, it would be like you meet a decision. So eine Entscheidung treffen. So there's I can't remember right now. Like it's kind of embarrassing to be honest. Like, but there are, for example, for this word of decision, like you can in some language will say make a decision, some language will say take a decision, some languages will say meet a decision. It's kind of interesting, like why which auxiliary verb you use to kind of like decide, so to speak.
Yes.
And it speaks a bit about the language itself. Like it's just something very random, like that I realized the other day, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of very interesting.
Yes. I'll give you an example. In Urdu, a language I speak, it's to do a decision. Karna is the
Yeah,
auxiliary to do, but there's a lot of
yeah,
do's.
exactly. Like exactly, like so. Just in a very random and small thing, you can already realize how different it is, like from the perspective like of the auxiliary verb. And I don't think that people consciously like think about it when they're like taking a decision, to be honest. But on the other hand, it kind of influences it because, like I always used to say, like you know, we all have our eyes to see the world, but kind of like the languages are the glasses we put on, and these are like the many nuances that the world has. And sometimes to grasp a certain nuance of reality, you need to change the glass and to see it from this or that perspective. And this is what makes you, so to speak, that enriches the experience of perceiving and dealing with the world. So this is always maybe why I wanted to learn many languages, because I always was interested about the different type of glasses, and it became natural. I mean, like for example, when I count the languages I speak, I mean I've dabbled also like with other languages like Irish, like from the very early age, because I had a big interest like in the word order and why the Celtic languages work this way and not like usually Indo-European. But and I also like fell in love with Hungarian and dabbled a bit with this language. I didn't reach the goal I wanted, but people sometimes ask me like, "Oh yeah, Matze, why didn't you learn like any like Asian language, for example,
Yeah.
or more than an African language, like or a more different African language, not an African language that's Indo-European, like
Hmm.
Afrikaans." And the reason is quite simple, and it is that it was more like the places I grew up with, and or the places I was encountering those languages in a certain way, led me to like develop a sort of interest for the language. So unfortunately, I've never been to Asia yet, and that's why like I haven't like started to learn, because I was also doing learning by the immersion effect. So basically, like being in a place surrounded by this language and then like developing the interest. So it ended up like being, for example, Western Europe and basically the Americas, and mostly were like West European languages spoken. Or I've been to South Africa too. So this was one thing I was realizing, like, oh yeah, this kind of Dutch, I kind of understand it. Why shouldn't I? You know, and this was kind of like natural thing that developed. Like, so I believe that um, I don't know where life's taking me professionally and stuff, and God knows where I will end up, like geographically speaking. But I'm always interested, like when I go to new places, I'm always interested, like, okay, what is really like the tongue that is spoken here in this region or in this place, and yeah, exactly. But I mentioned, for example, Hungarian and Welga, like Irish, being two languages I've dabbled in, and I really wish still to be able one day to speak them fluently, because I decided like, okay, what one first thing that was a painful decision I had to take, and I realized, to be honest, and I think like every like glossophile, so to speak, like a fan of languages will realize, that is that you cannot learn all languages of the world. Unfortunately, time is scarce, and this is like a sort of pain that we all have to share, that like we cannot learn as many really languages as we would like to, because the learning would never stop, so to speak. And I had a thing, because I saw another fellow polyglot of mine, like after making contact with the polyglot scene because of many international events and so forth. I saw that some polyglots, like this friend of mine, he had a challenge like to learn a certain amount of languages in a certain period of time.
Mm.
And I created a sort of artificial challenge for me, not as a competition, but just as a thing, like a fixed goal I set in my head that I would like to achieve. And it is like to become conversational, more or less. Like fluent is a very tricky word. I consider it to be a sort of non-word, because that's never like fixed, or people don't, it's people speak about it but mean different things. But I said I want to be conversational, want to be able to hold a conversation like we're having now, like a smooth conversation, in at least like 15 languages until my 30th birthday. So
Mm.
until May 2020, 25 exactly. Like, and I don't
Okay.
know if I'll reach it. If I wouldn't reach it, it's not the end of the world. But I put it like as a fixed goal, or something like concrete, so that I'd be like, okay, until this time frame, I want to do this and that. And some other people from the polyglot scene told me that it helps. It's kind of like to set like something concrete and real, like that you say, no, I want to learn one day Spanish. No, I want to learn to this until this specific date, this language on this specific level, or to achieve that specific goal. And that's what I'm trying to chase. And the hardest part was like the selection. I was realizing which languages I already spoke, and there were like like three, four spots left, and it was really like very painful to select like, oh, which languages am I going to learn and not. And like now, what I'm trying to do, so to speak, is because I was realizing that my attention like was being very sparse, in a sense that uh, I was always, when I learned something or heard something about a new language, I would stop everything I was doing and go and like dab in this other languages. And then I realized, okay, that's not being very helpful for me and for my goal, because my father was telling me like it's rather better to learn just a certain number of languages and know them well than just
Yeah.
to dab in 1,000 and not know them well. So I had to do this little sacrifice, at least for now, for achieving this imaginary goal I set for myself. And then I realized, okay, now I'm just trying to focus on the languages that that I put in the list, and Hungarian was the first non-Indo-European one. And I said, okay, there are many, many non-European languages I would love to deepen my knowledge in, but unfortunately, like the time is a problem in this regard. Like, it's really scarce, considering the fact that um, I do also have a career. I study at the university. I do a couple of stuff that is not associated to languages. So I wish I could just like stay the whole day and focus on my hobby, but yeah, it's difficult. Like I've heard it from many other polyglots too. Yeah.
I know how you feel, and I think that goal setting is very important for any challenge in life. So I think you're totally on the right path. Tell me about the other things that are not related directly to language that you are doing, your university career and all this other stuff. What are you up to these days?
Well, I think I studied in my undergraduate studies philosophy, and I'm now in my master's also pursuing like this philosophical career. Although I did a sort of change, because originally I'm also a social anthropologist. Like I did it as my minor during my undergraduate studies, but I decided to switch. And I was realizing that in my cultural studies, anthropology, dealing with the phenomena, what it is to be human and what is culture, like this sort of umbrella term that embraces several different aspects of human life. I realized that linguistics and like language in a way was something that was catching a lot my attention, like because we've it's a way that we formulate or create culture, like is like by words, like we create culture in words and expressions. And this is a huge deal of the lens or the glass that we're using to take a look at the world from this point of view. So I decided I wanted to study a philology in my master's, parallelly to philosophy. And philosophy, I think, matches well a philology because, like I said, your personal philosophy or your the way you see the world, you're going to describe it in the end in words, because every experience like I had in my life, in the end I try to formulate when I want to exchange this experience. Like it's a classical philosophical thing. We have a thing called the qualia. So it's a sensation we have, or sensations we have, and we try to like share this qualia I had with other individuals, but I cannot share the qualia itself.
Yes.
So if I see something or hear something give me chills, I need to find words, so to speak, to describe it, to try to explain the sensation that it is, because the sensation itself, I cannot pass it through you.
Mm.
And like I think in philosophy, many things, many problems go around or are related to communication and translation and the possibilities of translation and so forth. So in the end, it has something to do with language itself. But yeah, continuing the talk, like, because I tend to lose myself sometimes speaking. um, I decided to, like, I realized I decided, instead of studying general linguistics, I wanted to be more focused and just choose one certain language family or one branch of a language family to deepen myself in. And I decided, well, I speak a Germanic as a language as my native language, and I was always interested in also ancient literature and medieval literature. So I decided to deep dive in Germanic studies, especially focusing now on Old Norse literature corpus, but comparing it also to classical like Greek and Latin philosophical texts in this regard. So this is basically what I do. I decided also that I have a big passion not only for living languages, but also for dead languages, because this dead languages is a way that I have to communicate with the past, and I can sort of establish a dialogue with people that are no longer here. And it's for me a huge gift that I have from life, so to speak, because I can only communicate with these people that are long gone because of the text they left us. So I think, like, regardless of your native language, for example, in your case, if I would have had Urdu as my native language, I would have certainly tried to dive in like Sanskrit texts or
Yes.
in Arabic or old Persian texts.
Correct.
Like every language of the modern age, so to speak, almost has a sort of literary corpus from an ancient variant or from an ancient language that was spoken, that made pretty much the culture of the modern language we use today. Like, and I always recommend it, like, take your mother tongue and see what ancient language is that is close to your mother tongue literary corpus, and try to deepen that, because you'll see that, I don't know, like studying Greek, like as Western European, like studying Greek and Latin, like my head just like
Mm.
blew, in a sense, when I started like to think about like the words that they use to describe stuff. I had a very funny feeling that I had, like, that Greek, or I mean, I don't know much of modern Greek, to be honest. And I had also, I couldn't put it in the list anymore because the list was already full with 15 languages, so to speak. But taking a look at ancient Greek and comparing it, for example, with modern German, so to speak, or the German from the 18th century on, that many philosophers wrote in,
Mm.
it's super interesting because they're very similar languages, that it's like very easy to take like a Tetris. Like, you can take blocks and chunks of language and build concepts and to sort of explain what's going on. And this is a thing that I can do also, for example, with Hungarian. I mean, my knowledge of Hungarian is still very poor, unfortunately, but I realized that Hungarian has this thing similar to German, that you can put the compounds of language together, the
Mm-hmm.
roots, and then you create new terms. Like, and it's very, very interesting
Yes.
to describe qualia or nuances of reality that are difficult to put in words in
Mm.
this ancient languages or this philosophical language, so to speak. Although I would have to say, like, not to be wrongly understood, any language can be philosophical. So, but I
Yes.
was just speaking of languages that I knew already that had a known tradition in my region of the world, so to speak, of a literary corpus in this field of science, so to speak.
Absolutely. So you're saying that the agglutinative properties of German and Hungarian make it rich, that you just add a new meaning or reassemble like Tetris. That is awesome. Now, when you look at this is something that I've gained from talking to people who do similar work to you, where they work with old texts of a dead language and they get really immersed. Oftentimes, they have a few preferred texts that they were really passionate about when they first were exposed to it. Are there texts from Old Norse, for example, that you came across and you were like, ah, I feel a real connection to this one, for example? If so, what was that text about?
Well, I think that there are two texts that I think that are very interesting. One in Old Norse and one in Old Greek that I think there are in a certain way similar, but it's very interesting the poetry that is used because these are two poems in a way. It's in verses. One of them is so to speak the Voluspo, so the revelations of the seer, and the other one is Hesiod's Theogony. So these are two texts. Like the Voluspa is from the Poetic Edda, but we don't know who the author is. But it's both texts talking about the creation of the world and how the world emerges from chaos, so to speak. And it's very interesting to see also how certain elements are just there, that some people would point for. I mean, some people would say it's difficult to know, considering like that there is like like 1,000 years difference, so to speak, between this text, more or less. That that one, like the Voluspa, would the person who wrote it down, some people would say already had contact or knew about the material of Hesiod's Theogony. But on the other hand, still, if we would say that, if you would say that this verse is very archaic in a form, that because Germanic poetry is different from the classical Mediterranean poetry, because the classical Mediterranean poetry focus on hexameters, so a type of
Rhythm.
yeah, rhythm that you put to the poetry, and Germanic poetry focus, like old Germanic poetry, on alliteration. So
Hmm.
it's always like if something started with fa or sa, it would be fa 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 fa, fa, like
Yes.
from the words, so to speak.
Mm.
It's not on rhymes, so in this regard. And I mean, people could argue, and in the academia is very disputed in a certain way, like what, how, why is that some content is like similar. But I have like two kind of like, to keep it simple and stupid, so to speak, in a way, like as
Hmm.
a joke,
As a simple one.
that uh, maybe like some of them just reflect, the similar aspects just reflects things of a human condition, so to speak, that I like to call a human condition. And this is something like, okay, you can try to argue for maybe an Indo-European common root and stuff. This is also a possibility. It's also a possibility that somebody that had already, like, because of the literature in Iceland was mainly written by Christian monks, that these people perhaps had already had contact with Mediterranean classical literature. But it can also be that it's simply like also something neither Indo-European nor the context, but just something of the human condition. And they try to explain, when did the sky and the earth and like order arrived from like chaos, so to speak, and when did order win from chaos, and what will happen when chaos wins back, or like this sort of predictions of the future in regard. So I thought it was very interesting to compare like these two classical poems, because they always, in the case of the Völuspá, they which I know better in this regard than Hesiod's Theogony. It's more like Odin is trying to stop his own. It's very poetic. He's trying to stop, so to speak, his own death, so, or fate, because he knows the end of the world. So he realizes, and he sorts of wake up the a dead Sirius from the dead, who has been in hell, or like a equivalent to the Hades of classical mythology. and she's telling him about the creation of the world. So he's trying to get the knowledge also from the people who are long gone, so to speak. So, and it's interesting because like in we see that in the theogony and in the Veluspal that the gods cannot overcome their fate in the end, and this is this tragic element, this tragicon pathos, like people would say, like the tragic pain, so to speak, that is in humans, that some stuff not even the gods can overcome. So they are not that almighty in this regard compared to the Abrahamic religion streams that we know in the current world. And it's very, very fascinating to see how in which type of language and metaphors and sort of how can I put it, in sort of allegories and metaphors, they try to put the whole framework to explain in a very beautiful way. And I realize that poetry stays in the head. That's
Mm.
why perhaps like the also with the Rig Veda in the case of Sanskrit and many
Yes.
many other languages, like for Homer also in this regard, and for the Poetic Edda, the verses are so structured that it's easier to remind, and like in this way, because the verses are so tight, so to speak, like a patchwork, like a needle together, it's easier to remember and to record it.
Mm.
And I think one last point, um, like from ancient texts and talking about Old Norse more specifically, that I liked a lot is that if you read many of the sagas of the Icelanders, like the sagas like that were written about like 1200, 1300, and 1200 common era, it's interesting that they reminded me a lot when I was reading them about like the so-called American Wild West, or about the American expansion towards the West
Mm.
in the 19th century, because it's about people who are sort of leaving their home in Norway. So of course the accounts are 200 years after they did it, so to speak, or at least 200 years after they did it. But it's about this mix of fictionality, literature, and history, because
Mm.
it was considered history for many years, like this sort of accounts that they relate in the sagas. But people living at home, they having problems with the king and trying to create a sort of new world in Iceland. But on the other hand, there is no central government to regulate all the land disputes and little feuds that happen between the families and
Mm.
sort of oligarchies that are sort of originating in this piece of land. And now like the many battles and conflicts and fights that happen because of their belief, almost in a sort of manifest that it's like their wish and right to create a sort of new society or new world in this places like Iceland, Greenland, also in a certain way Vinland, so how they used to call North America, and or the Faroe Islands, or the Orkneys and Shetlands, so forth. So it's very interesting because I feel like I never could imagine that Viking and cowboys would have like something in common in this
Mm.
regard. But it was very fascinating to read some certain texts and sort of dialogues like, oh yeah, this town is too big for the two of us, and then like there is a sort of conflict after that. It's interesting to see how things completely different in time are still in a way related because of a sort of perhaps human condition in a certain way, things that are simply intrinsically human that could happen in any society. And this is what fascinates me the most. It makes me realize that we as humans and as social or political beings in a certain way are very, very similar, regardless of the frame. We put some elements here and there, like the sauce is kind of different, but it's everything from the same core, so to speak. So the
Well
human
said.
condition makes us. I firmly believe this, that this human condition makes us always ask, about the tragicality of life, and about the uncertainties and all the challenges, and how it is difficult to make order prevail and not let chaos take control and so forth. It's very, very, very fascinating, like
That's fan
regardless of time and place in human history.
That's fantastic. You've convinced me to check out the Voluspa. You've convinced me of why you do what you do, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's a good lesson for people in Hypia to see the diversity of interests and passions and depth versus breadth, the different glasses you can put on, so the new Worfian argument. And that's why I think having these conversations like we're having are so enriching. So I want to thank you for your time, and I think this is a good interview for people to learn about the various interests we have in Hypia. So thank you, Matheus.
Yeah, you're welcome. Like I'm always happy to encourage and exchange with my fellow language enthusiasts and polyglots and hyperpolyglots and so forth. Yeah, thank you very much for having